to view this as a duopoly, let's say it's the US and its satellites against Russia and its satellites, that's a profound misapprehension of the historical reality, because it wasn't Russia and its satellites, it was the Soviet Union, which was a bloc, and it's America with its allies. So America sits as first among equals, let's say, something like that, in a voluntary organization that's predicated on the preservation of freedom at the political level and at the economic level. And if we want evidence for that, we look at the response of the wall in Berlin, for example, to take not the least of the examples, but the crushing of Hungary and Czechoslovakia and almost Poland when the Soviet Union did fall, and look at the response to any manifestation of genuine autonomy on the part of the Soviets.
Because it's important to keep in mind that the Cold War was shaped by the fact that whereas we, the United States and Britain, and then a restored France, as we liberated territories, we made them free. And it was an alliance of free states, and it is a purely defensive alliance. There's absolutely no offensive provision in the NATO charter anywhere. So that's what we did. What did the Soviets do? Well, when the Red Army rolled into Eastern Europe, it did not liberate anybody. It drove off the German forces, and then it took control of those countries, installed puppet states, which were ruled from Moscow. How do we know that? Because there were periodic revolutions in the Eastern European states, which the United States and NATO did not foment and did not support, and which the Soviets crushed brutally with tanks repeatedly. So they established an empire in Eastern Europe, and they brought millions of forces into the heart of Europe and threatened to overrun all of Western Europe. And that was the threat against which NATO was formed. I tell you all of that to say that people talk about the buffer that the Russians feel that they need against the West. The NATO expansion was about giving the West a buffer from the threat that it had just managed to drive off of vast Soviet mechanized armies in the heart of Europe, poised to overrun all of the West. NATO is a security alliance, and the big part of this was gaining a buffer for the West so that Europe could actually have peace and develop peacefully and without fear, which the threat of Soviet invasion throughout the Cold War had denied it. But in addition to that, it was meant to be part of an effort that was successful to help those countries develop healthy democracies and healthy free market economies. And we invested...
And the capacity for some autonomous function at the national level, or for full autonomous function at the national level.
Right, complete, right, so we don't control them, right. The Soviet Union formally ends at the end of 1991, ended with Germany being reunited, and then all of Germany remaining in NATO. There was no further expansion of NATO until 1997. Okay, so that's very important. It is not like in 1990, it's not like the year after the Soviet Union fell, NATO expanded. Nor is it the case that the messages that were going from the West to Russia were, we're going to take all of the non-Russia parts of the former Soviet Union into NATO, but you Russians need to stay out. You're the adversary. On the contrary, NATO reached out to Russia also. And NATO established a Partnership for Peace program. And Russia was a member of the Partnership for Peace program, along with all of the other former Soviet states. And NATO did offer various forms of technical assistance. The US offered various forms of technical assistance to Russia in the 1990s. What did we, the West, think that NATO was doing in the 90s? And why were we admitting these former Warsaw Pact and then the Baltic states to the alliance? We wanted to make sure that we had a buffer against the kind of threat that the Soviets had brought into Central Europe. We liberated territories, we made them free. So that's what we did. What did the Soviets do? Well, when the Red Army rolled into Eastern Europe, it did not liberate anybody. It drove off the German forces, and then it took control of those countries, installed puppet states, which were ruled from Moscow. Because it's important to note that when Boris Yeltsin was president, he did not identify the West as the enemy. He sought to integrate into the West. He sought to westernize Russia, and he did to a considerable extent. And he sought to democratize Russia, and he did. And he had to fight off multiple efforts by the Communist Party of the former Soviet Union to regain power and reestablish communist rule. And he fought against that, and we did try to help him with that. Before we do that, there's a sea change that happens in Russia when Putin takes power. Because Yeltsin had been one thing, and then Putin is something else entirely. And Putin had become an anti-communist in the 1990s, and he helped Yeltsin fight off the attempts of the communists to regain power. But it's Putin who brought a new approach to this. And it's Putin who brought a real sense of grievance and anger. And the grievance was about the fall from greatness of the Soviet Union. Now,
gradually in this country, this is a nation that considers itself to be a great nation. Mm-hmm. It has that, call it a complex, call it whatever you want, but it's there. And the feeling that we're being treated like we're nobody. And finally, along comes Putin, who he got in the year 2000, as you know, but in 2007, at a meeting of the, I think, G20 in Munich, he made this famous speech in which he told the West, you cannot treat us this way. We refuse. And he's tremendously popular here because he's seen as the man who brought Russia back, who stood up to the West, and in particular to the United States, and said, we will not allow this. We have our interests.
And you had people like Leo Tolstoy arguing for the inherent, Russian soul as being distinctive and unique. Bolshevism, which triumphed in 1917, was an explicit rejection of the Western political economic model and a move in a different, unique direction. So there was a narrative of Russian uniqueness, and there is an inherent sort of Russian messianism, and the messianism actually goes all the way back to Ivan the Terrible. There are these strands in Russian thought going back centuries that Russia is a unique kind of place, and that it must be a unique kind of place. And then, of course, as the Soviet Union was one of two global superpowers with the United States, when Putin is talking about the geostrategic calamity of the fall of the Soviet Union, what he really means is the loss of Russia's privileged position as one of the two rulers of the world. And what he is aspiring to is reestablishing that.
Gradually in this country, this is a nation that considers itself to be a great nation.
From the end of the Napoleonic Wars on, Russia politically has regarded itself as something more than European. And the acquisition of Asian territories, among other things, in the 19th century has led Russians to see themselves as European and also.
Because he's taking the words Nazi and genocide and not just making them meaningless, he's debasing them, he's perverting them. His claim is that those words mean whatever I say they mean. He is making the claim that I, as the leader of Russia, define those words. And by extension, those words mean nothing besides power. So this, I'm trying to say, is now a competing interpretation of the Second World War, which says that the meaning of the Second World War is that the leader of Russia has the capability to describe anyone he wants as Nazis, to accuse anyone he wants of genocide, and that if he succeeds in doing that and destroying a nation and bringing people to trial and so on, then all that vocabulary, all those institutions, all of the psychological and moral basis upon which the European Union has been built, that's all gone. That is all gone.
I mean, what he is out to do is to try to resurrect some form of Russian empire. Never mind communism, never mind the Soviet Union. I think looking at this otherwise somewhat deranged speech that he gave at the start of this conflict, you can actually understand quite a bit of what Putin thinks that he's after. And to him, it is about not recognizing Ukrainian statehood, but more importantly, not recognizing Ukrainian nationhood, right?
Because here's the thing. This kind of story that Mr. Putin is telling is a basically fascist story. It's a story about how once upon a time, nothing was fragmented. There was purity. Someone got baptized. There was water. They were purified. Everything was purified. And his name was Vladimir. And my name is also Vladimir. That is quite literally the story. That is the story. It has been said in basically so many words. He's also said it at the length of 7,000 words in a published paper. But that is basically the story. And that is a fascist story. The story that the world was once united. The story that the world was once united and pure, but it has been fragmented and broken by outsiders. That is Mr. Putin's version. The version is that everything which is Ukraine comes from outside. It's the Poles, it's the Germans, it's the Austrians, it's the Americans. That's all artificial. And so if you can just strip that away, then you come back to the real story, the unity, this imagination that he has about the last 1,000 years.
The one thing that it is necessary to have in people's minds here, the 1990s was a horrific time for Russians. Mm-hmm. Okay? It was a horrible period for Russians to live through. And it was an unbelievable humiliation for someone like Putin, who believes in Russia, that Russia should be one of the world's two superpowers, to have gone through that experience. So Yeltsin tried to lead his country through that with its democracy intact, and he succeeded until Putin destroyed it. Yeltsin was never able to fix the economy, really. So Putin comes in with a deep sense of grievance and burning with humiliation at what had happened to the Russians in the 90s. And he needed an explanation that came readily to hand for why that had happened. And on the one hand, he blamed Gorbachev for surrendering instead of fighting. And he bitterly resents the fact that Gorbachev didn't kill as many millions of people as he needed to just to stay in power. But he also blamed the West in many respects, mostly unfairly, honestly, for Russia's humiliation. And then we had a narrative rapidly emerge in the early Putin years that not only had the West contributed to Russia's humiliation in this way and mistreated Russia in various ways in the 90s, but now the West was trying to prevent Russia, as he kept saying, from rising from its knees. And that the West was trying to keep Russia down. And he began to elaborate a series of narratives which attributed all kinds of malevolence and, frankly, much more thinking and coherence in Western policies than has ever existed in them to us, and also made the mistake that most humans make of solipsism, of imagining that he was at the center of everybody's thought and that everything that we were doing in the world was aimed at Russia in some way. And so he created this narrative, which he has been pumping into the Russian population ever since.
What public opinion polls tend to show is that the overwhelming majority of Russians believe the United States to be the most threatening country to their lives. In other words, they believe that if the United States could, it would wipe them out. And that if the United States people say, the American president, that we would like to see a strong, democratic Russia. Nah, that's not true. They don't want to see a strong Russia. They want to see a weak Russia. In fact, they'd like Russia to fall apart like the Soviet Union did. That's what they really want. They want to take over our wealth, our natural resources, our oil and our gas and our metal. That's what they want.
Well, when things are going chaotically wrong, one of the simplest things to do always is to identify the that make a unitary assumption of cause and to make it external.
Of course.
It's convenient in 50 ways.
Right.
First of all, it gives you an enemy to unite against. It gives you an enemy to talk about politically. It solves your conscience. It's also very simple because the reason that this former Soviet Union was so catastrophically chaotic in the 1990s, the reasons for that are unbelievably complicated and detailed.
Right.
And they go all the way from the highest levels of government to the nature of arrangements within families, right? The whole society was authoritarian for 70 years, murderously authoritarian. And to unravel that and to take responsibility for it and to figure out how to fix it is way harder than to blame almost all of it on an external enemy.
Right.
Especially when you're also motivated, as you said, by this sense of thwarted destiny, which we could identify. I mean, in the West, we do regard a certain degree of patriotism as noble and justifiable. And you can see how that, under some conditions, noble and justifiable motivation would get hijacked if there was also reason to externalize blame for conditions, for resentment generated by genuine chaos.
Right.
Well, when things are going chaotically wrong, one of the simplest things to do always is to identify make a unitary assumption of cause and to make it external.
Of course.